The veil hanging from the bedpost smelled faintly of starch and lavender, and in the gray light before dawn, it looked less like bridal lace than something laid aside for mourning. Rain tapped at the window panes of Vane House with a patient, wintry sound, though spring had already touched the hedges beyond the garden wall. In that dim chamber at the back of the house, where the fire was always allowed to burn low and the mirrors were turned just slightly away from the light, Lavinia Ashcombe had spent 3 years learning how silence could be used like a lock. Her aunt, Mrs. Drusilla Vane, never called it cruelty. She called it prudence. A girl with a damaged face, she would sigh to callers. A girl made nervous by strangers. A poor child whose mind had never quite recovered after her father's death. It was always said gently, almost piously, over poured tea and folded napkins and the little clink of silver against china. That was what made it so effective. Lies spoken loudly invite challenge. Lies spoken with sorrow are often taken for truth. Yet there was nothing feeble in Lavinia's mind. She had simply learned the cost of showing it. If she corrected an account in the household book, Drusilla smiled and told the maid the child had copied the figures from memory without understanding them. If she asked after a tenant's widow or a lease on the North Fields, her aunt's mouth tightened, and by evening some small comfort would be removed: a candle, an hour in the library, the privilege of walking alone in the side garden. The punishments were neat, respectable, hard to name. And so the house itself had begun to feel like a lesson in submission: polished banisters that creaked under careful feet, closed doors that smelled of beeswax and old paper, corridors where servants lowered their voices the moment she passed. Only once had Lavinia tried openly to resist. A month after her father was buried, she had written to his oldest friend, a retired magistrate who had dined at their table every Michaelmas. She remembered the rough drag of the pen, the blot of ink where her hand shook, the hot pressure in her throat as she begged him to come. She never received a reply, nor to the second letter, nor the third. After that, she stopped asking the footman whether the post had gone out. But she did not stop noticing things. She noticed that her aunt kept the key to the escritoire on a black ribbon at her wrist. She noticed the locked drawer in the morning room where estate papers disappeared. And on this wet, chill morning, as the household stirred below stairs and a maid shook cinders from the grate, she noticed something else. Through the half-open door, drifting up from the passage, came Drusilla's voice, light, pleased, almost triumphant. "The Duke need not be troubled with details," she said. "He has agreed. The girl will be veiled." Lavinia stood very still. The rain kept tapping at the glass. Somewhere below, a drawer shut. And in that one sentence, she heard the shape of the trap that was being built around her. If you'd like to stay with this story, subscribe and come a little further with her. By breakfast, the house had resumed its ordinary sounds, but to Lavinia they no longer felt ordinary at all. The urn hissed on the sideboard. Toast cooled untouched beneath a silver cover. Rainwater slid from the eaves in a steady drip outside the breakfast room windows. Across the table, Drusilla spread orange marmalade on a slice of bread with the composed hand of a woman who had slept well. Her cap ribbons were fresh, her cuffs snowy, and there was that brightness in her eye again, the kind that came whenever some private calculation had gone in her favor. She spoke of the weather first, then of a call she expected from Mr. Felbrick, the family solicitor. Then, very gently, as though approaching a skittish child, she turned to the subject she had already decided could no longer be delayed. "My dear," she said, "a singular opportunity has presented itself. His Grace, the Duke of Stratton, has shown an interest in making you his wife." Lavinia set down her cup before she answered. The china had gone warm beneath her fingers. "He has never seen me." "A mercy, perhaps," said Drusilla, dabbing the corner of her mouth. Men of sense often prefer to arrange serious matters without the fever of first impressions. His Grace is in mourning still. He has no taste for the noise and vanity of a season. What he requires is quiet, obedience, gratitude. Her gaze lifted and rested on Lavinia's face with that same sorrowful softness she wore for other people. He has been told enough to understand your condition. The lie was offered so calmly that for a moment the room itself seemed to lean around it. Lavinia could smell the bitter tea leaves in the pot, the faint beeswax from the polished table, the coal smoke working its way down the chimney. She knew better than to ask what condition had been described. She had lived inside the answer too long. Instead, she said, "And my father's estate?" It was the one question that changed Drusilla's expression. Only by a degree, only for a breath, yet Lavinia saw it. The aunt's fingers paused. "Your father trusted me to manage difficult matters." "That was not what I asked." A little chill entered the room. Drusilla folded her napkin with exact care. "When a young lady is so dependent upon family protection, she does herself no good by meddling in legal questions. You will find, if this marriage proceeds, that His Grace values peace in his household. I would advise you to cultivate the same." So there it was. Not only the marriage, but the terms of it. She was to go from one silence to another, carrying a false reputation into a great house where it would protect the thief who sent her there. Later, when the maid came to brush out her hair, Lavinia stood before the narrow window in her room and watched the path darken under fresh rain. A rook hopped along the wall and shook out its wings. Below, a gig rolled into the square of wet gravel before the front steps. Mr. Felbrick climbed down with his leather case tucked beneath one arm, and Drusilla herself went to receive him. That, by itself, meant the matter was deeper than marriage articles. Lavinia waited until the front hall swallowed them both. Then she slipped into the passage outside her aunt's morning room, where the wallpaper smelled faintly of damp and lavender powder, and put her hand against the paneled door. Inside, Felbrick spoke first, low and uneasy. "If the codicil is ever examined beside the earlier settlement, madam, there may be questions." And Drusilla answered, in a voice nearly lost beneath the crackle of the fire, "Then it must never be examined." She did not move at once. Her palm remained against the panel, feeling the faint tremor of voices through old oak, while the fire inside clicked and settled. Mr. Felbrick murmured something she could not catch. Drusilla answered more sharply, and then the scrape of a chair warned her back into the passage. By the time she reached the turn in the corridor, her breath had gone thin and cold. A codicil. The word itself had a dry, papery sound in her mind. It belonged to lawyers, to deathbeds, to signatures made under candlelight while families waited outside doors. And if her aunt feared examination, then the theft had been dressed in lawful clothes. That afternoon, no one spoke to her of legal matters again. Instead, the house prepared her future as if it were an act of mercy. The seamstress was sent for. A maid was told to air the linen chest. Drusilla wrote 3 letters in quick succession, sealing each one with black wax while the rain light faded from the windows. Lavinia sat in the morning room with her work untouched in her lap and let the pattern emerge. She knew now that the marriage and the missing estate were bound together. Her aunt meant to send her away under a cloud of pity, while whatever had been stolen remained safe behind forms and signatures. And the man at the center of it, the Duke, was still no more to her than a title and a rumor. Rumor, in houses like that, traveled faster than the post. By evening, even the kitchen maid knew something of him. His Grace of Stratton had buried a young duchess scarcely a year before. The child born to them had lived only a handful of days. Since then, he had left his seat in the country only when duty dragged him into view. He did not dance, did not linger in drawing rooms, did not invite admiration. Some said grief had turned him stern. Others said he had always been so, and sorrow had only stripped away the need to pretend otherwise. What mattered to Drusilla was simpler. A mourning man might be persuaded to value quiet above charm, obedience above curiosity, and a wife spoken of as damaged might seem almost useful to one who wished never again to be deeply known. When she was summoned after dinner, the candles in her aunt's room had been freshly trimmed. The air smelled of sealing wax and rose vinegar. Felbrick had gone. In his place, on the little escritoire, lay a folded sheet and a packet tied with narrow blue ribbon. Drusilla looked almost serene. "You will oblige me by understanding your good fortune," she said. "His Grace has no taste for spectacle. You will not require visits, flirtation, or the tiresome parade by which foolish girls imagine themselves chosen. The settlements are being prepared. The wedding will be private, very proper, very soon." "How soon?" Lavinia asked. "In a fortnight." The answer fell between them with the weight of a locked gate. Drusilla picked up the ribboned packet and held it out. "These are patterns for your wedding dress, a veil as well, thick enough to spare you embarrassment, and him discomfort." Lavinia took the packet. The silk inside whispered against her fingers like a warning. Then her aunt added, almost carelessly, "You need only remain silent until the vows are spoken." And now, Lavinia began to wonder whether silence itself might be the only thing she could no longer afford. At that same hour, while Vane House held its breath around locked drawers and whispered bargains, the Duke of Stratton stood in the library of his London residence with an unopened letter resting against the edge of the mantel. A coal fire burned low behind its guard, giving off that dry iron warmth which never quite reaches the far corners of a large room. Books climbed the walls in dark ranks. The curtains were only partly drawn, and through the long panes the afternoon looked colorless, as if the whole city had been washed in watered ink. Elias Thorne had lived for many months in rooms ordered to perfection, because order was easier to bear than feeling. His secretary, Mr. Pritchard, had left the letter there with the other papers requiring a decision: estate returns, a tenant dispute, a note from his sister, Lady Honoria, urging him to come down to supper next Thursday and behave like a man still among the living. And at the bottom of the little stack, Drusilla Vane's hand, narrow and exact, offering the particulars of her ward. Elias broke the seal only because postponement would have been its own kind of answer. The letter was skillfully made. It spoke of lineage, modest habits, excellent moral upbringing, and a temperament well suited to a quiet house. It acknowledged, with the practiced tenderness of one hiding a knife inside velvet, that the young lady had been touched by misfortune in both person and spirits, and had therefore been spared the common vulgarity of display. She would never trouble her husband with vanity. She desired retirement. She was grateful for guidance. Pritchard, standing by the desk with a folio under one arm, cleared his throat and said what men like him said when a duke required a wife and the matter must be made plain. "It appears a practical union, Your Grace." Practical. Elias had come to hate that word, and yet he was weary enough to accept it. Since the deaths in his family, every conversation of consequence had turned upon necessity. The line must be secured, the household must be settled, a duchess must be found. He had seen what society called love, and what it often demanded from a grieving man afterward was performance. He had no appetite for bright young women trained to charm a ballroom and fill a house with callers. He wanted calm. He wanted a wife who would not force gaiety where none could be honestly offered. Still, his hand remained on the letter longer than was needed. "She is willing?" he asked at last. Pritchard consulted a note. "Her guardian assures me she is shy to excess, but wholly compliant." The answer should have satisfied him. Instead, it sat badly on the ear. Compliant. The fire settled with a soft collapse. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock struck the quarter hour. Elias looked again at the page, at the measured pity with which the aunt described the girl's defects, and a faint distaste touched him. Not for the unknown bride, for the tone. Yet weariness has led many honorable people into smaller failures than cruelty, and one of them is this: accepting an arrangement because it promises to ask little of the heart. At length he set the letter down. "Very well," he said. "Proceed." Pritchard bowed and withdrew with the papers. Elias remained by the fire after the door closed, listening to the rain begin at last against the windows. He told himself the matter was settled. He told himself duty would be simpler this way. But when he glanced back toward the mantel, his eye caught on a final enclosure he had nearly missed: a short postscript in Drusilla's hand. For reasons of the young lady's extreme sensibility, her face must remain veiled throughout the ceremony. After that, the days began to move with a dreadful smoothness, as if the house itself had accepted that something final was being arranged within its walls. Drusilla did not bother to hide her management. Tradesmen came and went. Boxes were carried down from the attics. A mantua maker arrived, with pins in her sleeve and tape about her neck, and was shown upstairs under strict instruction that the bride must be dressed with modesty, concealment, and mercy in mind. The word mercy seemed to follow Lavinia now like an insult wrapped in ribbon. The gown chosen for her was of pale silk, handsome enough in cost, but severe in line. Its sleeves were long, its bodice high. There was no softness to it, no little grace placed there for pleasure. And the veil was folded in tissue paper and gave off the clean, dry smell of pressed lace. When the woman shook it out, it fell in a thick white cloud from her hands nearly to the carpet. Even she paused a moment. "It is uncommon full," she murmured, before remembering herself and glancing toward Drusilla. The aunt smiled and said a bride of delicate nerves must be shielded from notice. Lavinia stood on the fitting stool while pins bit lightly at the silk around her waist. She said almost nothing. Silence had become, in that house, a form of labor. Yet her quietness was not blank endurance. Her mind was at work all the while, sorting details the way another woman might sort threads by shade. Which maid looked frightened when Drusilla entered? Which footman had served her father long enough to remember better days? Who carried messages to the village? Who had access to the back gate? She had no proof yet, only dread sharpened by that overheard warning about the codicil. But dread, if attended to carefully, could become a kind of map. In the afternoons, she was left alone more often than before. Drusilla mistook stillness for defeat. That misjudgment gave Lavinia room to observe. Twice she saw fresh ash in the grate of the morning room, though the day was warm enough that no fire was needed. Once she passed the housekeeper's closet and heard two servants exchanging whispers about the Duke's mourning and the odd haste of the ceremony. Another time she found the writing slope in her own room shifted by half an inch from where she kept it, and knew someone had searched it while she was below stairs. So she began hiding small things elsewhere: a pencil stub inside the hem of an old shawl, a scrap of blank paper behind a loosened panel at the back of the washstand. Tiny preparations. Poor weapons, perhaps, but they gave shape to her resolve. On the fourth evening before the wedding, the weather changed. The rain stopped at last, and the whole house seemed to exhale damp into the cooling air. A band of amber light stretched across the upper landing, touching the banister and the faded runner beneath her feet. Lavinia had just dismissed the maid who laced her gown for supper when a soft, hurried tapping came at the door between her bedchamber and dressing closet. It was not the maid returning. It was old Mrs. Kettle from the still room, cheeks pink from haste, apron smelling faintly of rosemary and starch. She shut the door behind her and lowered her voice. "Miss Lavinia, there is a woman below at the servants' entrance. She says she once dressed your aunt's hair. She says you will remember Martha Bell." Lavinia did remember. Mrs. Kettle swallowed. "She says she must see you tonight, and she brought something wrapped in cloth." Lavinia did not keep Mrs. Kettle waiting. She drew on a dark shawl, tucked the candle into a horn lantern, and followed the old woman down the back stair where the air grew cooler with each step and smelled of damp stone, rosemary, and bread just taken from the ovens. The servants' passage was lit only by one wall sconce, guttering in its dish. At the far end, near the outer door, a woman stood with rain on her hem and a plain cloak clasped tight at the throat. She had grown thinner, and there were silver threads in her dark hair that Lavinia did not remember, but the set of her shoulders was the same. "Martha Bell," Lavinia said softly. The dismissed maid dropped a hurried curtsy. "Miss Ashcombe, forgive the boldness. I would not have come if there were any other honest road left." Mrs. Kettle, with more courage than ceremony, ushered them into the still room and shut the door. The place was warm from the banked stove. Bundles of drying herbs hung from the rafters. Glass jars caught the lantern light in little amber and green flashes. Martha set a parcel on the scrubbed wooden table between them. The cloth around it was coarse, once white, now grayed by travel and weather. Her fingers shook as she untied the knot. "I served your aunt too closely for too long," she said. "When I asked questions, I was turned off with half wages and told I should be grateful for them. I kept silent then. I have been ashamed of that silence every day since." Inside the wrapping lay a narrow ledger bound in brown calf, a folded legal paper, and two smaller scraps, blackened at the edges as though rescued from a grate. The sight of those charred bits stopped Lavinia's breath for a moment. She knew her own hand at once. One was the beginning of the letter to the retired magistrate. The other was addressed to her mother's cousin in Bath. She had written both in hope. She had watched for answers that never came. Now the truth lay before her in smoke-stained fragments. Martha touched the folded paper but did not open it. "That is the forged codicil. I saw Mr. Felbrick bring it once, late after your father was gone. Your aunt said no one must ever compare it to the first settlement. She paid a copying clerk for his trouble. I know because the sum went through me in household cash, marked as mourning linen. Later, when you wrote letters, Madam took them herself from the tray in the hall. Some she opened with steam. The rest she burned unread." Lavinia laid her hand on the book. The leather felt cold despite the warm room. When she opened it, the pages gave off the dry smell of ink and dust. Entries marched down the columns in Drusilla's own neat figures. Payments to the solicitor. Payments to a clerk named Ames. Money drawn against the estate for funeral expenses, far larger than she remembered. And there, 3 lines below, a note in the margin. "Codicil secured." Martha drew in a breath. "There is more. Turn to the back pages, miss. I think that is where she wrote what she never meant another soul to read." Lavinia turned the pages exactly as Martha had told her, slowly, with the care one gives to something that may alter the course of a life. The account book grew stranger toward the end. The neat household columns broke apart into hurried memoranda, sums circled twice, names written without titles, reminders pressed into the margins as if Drusilla had trusted paper more than memory. The lantern flame trembled behind its horn pane. Outside, wind brushed the kitchen court and stirred the loose end of the latch. In the still room, among dried mint and lavender, the truth began to show its shape. There were entries for mourning gloves that had never been ordered, black crepe charged twice over, and wine billed for guests who had not been present at the funeral breakfast. Then came the lines that mattered. "Mr. Ames, for fair copy. F. secure. Witness fee advanced." And farther down, cramped into the gutter of the page, a note so cold in its plainness that Lavinia had to read it twice before its meaning fully entered her. Girl continues to write. Must watch tray. Below that another. Veil indispensable. They were not emotional. They did not need to be. They revealed purpose with far more force than outrage ever could. Martha stood with both hands locked together, watching Lavinia's face. "I feared it was so," she said in a whisper. She spoke often as though the estate were already hers by right, as though you were only some burden attached to it. Lavinia did not answer for a moment. She had gone very still. The charred letter scraps lay beside the book like bones taken from ash, and beside them the folded legal paper waited. At last she opened that, too. The forged codicil was written in a clerk's formal hand, with stiff phrases her father would never have chosen. He had been exact in speech, even in kindness. He did not call his daughter the said girl. He did not speak of domestic unsuitability. He had never once in all his life confused prudence with contempt. And yet there it was, beneath the strained language, a signature meant to be his. Her throat tightened then, not from fear, but from the old grief returning with a different face. Until that hour she had lived beneath loss and humiliation as if they were weather. Now she could see design in them. Her father's absence had been used, his dying hour had been handled like an opening in a lock. Mrs. Kettle made the sign of the cross against her apron, without seeming to know she had done it. Martha, emboldened now that the papers were open, reached into her cloak and drew out one last thing. A narrow, folded sheet tucked inside a worn prayer book cover. "I took this, too," she said. "I thought at first it was only one of the old household memoranda. Then I saw the date." Lavinia unfolded it. It was not a will. It was a note in her father's hand, addressed to Felbrick, brief and clear, written some weeks before his final illness. It referred to the earlier settlement already discussed for my daughter's secure benefit, and directed that no alteration be made without her future knowledge. For the first time that night, Lavinia looked up with something fiercer than sorrow in her eyes. "If this exists," Martha said, her voice shaking now for another reason, "then your aunt did more than lie. She built the lie after he could no longer stop her." The candle on the table gave a soft spit of tallow. Somewhere above them, in the body of the house, a bell rang for the last prayers before bed. Lavinia folded her father's note with careful fingers and said, very quietly, "Then I will not run." Martha stared. "Miss, if you stay, she will send you into that church covered head to foot and keep you silent all the same." Lavinia placed the note beside the scorched letters and the false paper. Her face had changed. The fear was still there, but it had been ordered into purpose. "No," she said. "She means to use the wedding to hide me. I mean to use it where she cannot stop me." Once the decision was spoken, the room seemed to narrow around it. Mrs. Kettle stared as if she had heard a prayer uttered backward. Martha looked frightened for her, which was only natural. To remain in that house and walk willingly toward the church Drusilla had prepared was to step nearer the hand that had already struck without leaving marks. Yet Lavinia's mind had passed beyond fear into order. She gathered the papers into 3 small stacks on the still-room table and began to speak as she had not spoken in years, plainly, without asking permission. "The book must not remain in the house if my aunt grows suspicious," she said, "nor the note in my father's hand. The scorched letters I will keep. They are mine, and if they are seen too soon, she will know what has been discovered." Martha nodded quickly. "I can take the book. There is a cousin of mine in the village, married to the saddler. Honest people. It would be safe there for a day or 2. "For longer if needed," Mrs. Kettle put in, recovering herself. "And there is Mr. Blaine, the parish clerk. He served your father at the old chapel before the Restoration. He knows his hand as well as any man alive." That was the first mercy of the night. Not rescue, which could still fail, But witnesses. Lavinia had been denied them so long that the simple thought of one truthful eye, then another, felt almost strange. She folded her father's note inside the lining of her work box. The forged codicil she wrapped in the coarse cloth again and handed to Martha together with the ledger. The still-room fire ticked softly. Somewhere above, doors were closing one by one along the upper passage as the household settled to sleep. Then came the harder question. "If I speak at the church," Martha said, lowering her voice still further, "who will let you finish?" Lavinia's gaze moved to the thick veil lying over the back of a chair where the mantua maker had left it earlier that day. Even in the still room it seemed to give off coldness. "Custom will let me nearer the altar than any other place in the world," she said. "My aunt may command this house. She may command the servants. She may even have misled the Duke. But she cannot stop a spoken charge once witnesses have heard it." Mrs. Kettle crossed herself again, more deliberately this time. "Then you must have it in order, child. No trembling, no confusion. Those people will forgive wickedness sooner than they forgive a woman for sounding uncertain." Lavinia accepted the truth of that with a slight incline of her head. Before leaving the still room, she asked for writing things. Mrs. Kettle brought a blunt pencil and 2 sheets torn from an old household ledger. There, beside hanging bundles of thyme and sage, Lavinia began to set down the sequence in which she would speak if the moment came. First the note, then the codicil, then the burned letters. Dates, names. The line from the book, "Girl continues to write." She did not rehearse anger, she rehearsed clarity. By the time she returned upstairs, the house was silent and dark except for one candle burning beneath the sconce outside Drusilla's room. Lavinia paused in the passage. Through the door came the faint murmur of her aunt's voice. She was not alone. A man answered in tones too low to catch, and then Drusilla said distinctly, "You need only see that the vicar asks no questions beyond the form. After that, the girl will belong elsewhere." The house was awake before dawn on the wedding morning. Floorboards answered hurried feet. A scuttle of coal was set down in the passage outside Lavinia's room. Somewhere below, a kitchen door banged once against the wind and then shut again. The sky beyond the windows was the pale, hard gray of tin, and a fine rain had returned in the night, laying a wet sheen over the gravel and the clipped yews by the front drive. Everything felt sharpened by waiting. Drusilla came to her before breakfast with an expression of tender authority that might have convinced a stranger. She carried the veil herself over both hands, as one might bear a relic. "There must be no agitation today," she said. "No delay, no little scenes. You have been done a great kindness, and you will show yourself worthy of it." Her fingers settled briefly at Lavinia's shoulder, light as dust and just as cold. "Remember what I told you. Once the ceremony begins, silence will be your safest friend." Lavinia lowered her eyes and answered softly enough to satisfy her. She had hidden the small, scorched letters inside the prayer book she was permitted to carry. Her father's note lay stitched into the inner band of her sleeve, with clumsy little stitches made by candlelight. Martha had gone before sunrise with the account book and the forged codicil wrapped in sacking beneath turnips in a market basket. If all had gone as planned, Mr. Blaine would meet them at the church vestry with those papers close at hand. The arrangement was fragile. So was glass. Both could still cut. The dressing itself seemed to take hours, pins caught in the silk, laces pulled. The heavy veil was settled over her head at last, and the world became a softened whiteness through which candle flames blurred like distant stars. It smelled of starch, old lavender, and the faint cedar scent of the chest where it had been kept. The maid who fastened it under Lavinia's hair did so with trembling hands. She whispered, "God keep you, miss," so quietly that Drusilla, standing by the fire with her gloves on, did not hear. The journey to the church passed in the muffled dark of the carriage. Rain tapped the roof in an even measure. Drusilla sat opposite, composed and upright, one gloved hand resting over the other as if escorting a dutiful niece into comfort. Lavinia could make out little through the veil, only the movement of bare branches and stone walls sliding by. But she felt every turn of the wheels. She counted them without meaning to. When the carriage finally slowed, the bells had not rung. That, somehow, made the moment graver. St. Jude's stood under the wet morning like something waiting to judge the living as sternly as the dead. The porch steps shone dark with rain. Inside, candles had been lit against the gloom, and their gold wavered across damp stone, polished pews, and the black silk sleeves of the few invited witnesses. The gathering was small, just as Drusilla had wished, small enough to control, she had thought. Yet even through the veil, Lavinia sensed more watchfulness than her aunt expected. Near the chancel stood a grave woman in deep violet, her silver hair untouched by fashion. Lady Honoria, no doubt. Beside the vestry door, half in shadow, waited Mr. Blaine with his old prayer book tucked beneath one arm. And at the altar, tall and still in black coat and white cravat, stood the Duke of Stratton. Lavinia did not see his face clearly, only the impression of a man holding himself in absolute command. He turned as she approached. The vicar opened his book. Drusilla's hand tightened on her arm for one small instant and then released it. The first words of the service rose into the candle-lit air, and beneath the fold of her sleeve, Lavinia felt the edge of the hidden paper against her wrist. The service moved forward with the calm inevitability of water finding its course. The vicar's voice, practiced and mild, rose beneath the stone arch and returned in softened echoes. Wax trembled in the tall candles beside the altar. Rain whispered at the church windows. Lavinia stood within the white dimness of the veil and listened to words she had heard at other weddings, words of solemn joining and lawful intention, yet never had they sounded so sharpened by danger. Each familiar phrase seemed to ask the same thing of her. If truth is to be spoken, when? Beside her, the Duke of Stratton remained very still. She could not clearly see his features through the lace, only the dark impression of his coat sleeve, the pale line of his hand, the measured rise and fall of his breathing. Yet even without sight she felt a change in him. He was attentive now. Not warm, not intimate, not even curious in any ordinary sense, simply alert. Her silence read differently to him now. It had become something else, something held in readiness. Drusilla, on the other hand, had begun to relax. Lavinia heard it in the faint rustle of silk from the front pew, in the small ease of a woman who believes the last difficult step is nearly taken. The man she had spoken with the night before sat 2 rows behind her aunt, broad-faced and stiff in a black coat that smelled faintly, when he passed near, of wet wool and pomade. Likely the curate from a neighboring parish, or some legal witness procured for convenience. Whoever he was, he looked straight ahead and never once toward the bride. The vicar turned a page. The paper made a dry, delicate sound in the hush. When he spoke the question of impediment, the old form seemed almost unbearable in its innocence. If any man know cause... The phrase hung there for a breath, ancient and formal, and then was allowed to pass unanswered. Of course it was. A woman in a veil had not been counted among those expected to answer. Lavinia felt the edge of the hidden note at her wrist and knew, with a strange calm, that the opening would not come from anyone else. Her thoughts sharpened into sequence. First, uncover her own face. Not for revelation, not for effect, but because people listen differently when they must meet the speaker's eyes. Then her father's note. Then the forged codicil, if Mr. Blaine was ready. Then the burnt letters. No tears, no pleading. Dates, names, words. Let them hear what had been done. Let the theft stand in daylight under God's roof. The vicar asked for the bride's hand. A tremor moved through her then, not enough to be seen, only enough to remind her she was made of flesh, not iron. The Duke turned slightly toward her. His gloved fingers waited, patient and formal. Somewhere behind them, a pew creaked. Lady Honoria shifted. Drusilla gave the faintest sigh. Lavinia placed her hand where the ritual required. The Duke's touch was cool, controlled. For one suspended instant, she wondered whether he would recoil from scandal, from interruption, from the collapse of the orderly transaction he had been promised. Then she understood that such wondering could not matter now. The moment had arrived, whether he proved friend, witness, or obstacle. The vicar drew breath to continue. Before he could speak the next line, Lavinia stepped forward, reached up with her free hand, and said in a clear, steady voice, "Before this marriage proceeds, I must be heard." The words did not ring out loudly, yet they altered the whole church. The vicar stopped with his mouth still half open above the book. Rain pressed more clearly at the windows. A candle gave a small hiss beside the altar. Every person present seemed to understand all at once that the smooth course of the morning had broken. For one suspended heartbeat, no one moved. Then Lavinia raised both hands to the lace at her temples and loosed the pins herself. The veil slipped down over her shoulders with a soft rush of fabric, gathering at her elbows like fallen mist. She did not turn first toward the Duke. She did not look toward her aunt. She faced the congregation, pale from strain but perfectly composed, and let them see the plain truth their gossip had refused to seek. There was no monstrous injury hidden beneath the lace, no vacancy in the eyes, no childish confusion. Only a young woman standing upright before the altar, her gloved fingers steady against the edge of her prayer book. Across the front pew, Drusilla made a sound so small it was almost lost in the rustle that followed. The broad-faced man behind her shifted sharply. Lady Honoria rose at once, not in alarm, but in attention. Near the vestry door, Mr. Blaine straightened, as if called to order after a long wait. Lavinia opened the prayer book and drew out the blackened scraps first. Her voice, when she spoke again, did not tremble. "I ask pardon of this church for interrupting the service," she said. "But I have been brought here under false representations, and if I do not speak now, I shall be silenced in the only place where my words may yet be witnessed." The vicar looked helplessly from her to the Duke. Elias had turned fully toward his bride now. The restraint in his face remained, yet not the blank reserve of a man enduring duty. He was listening with grave, concentrated stillness. He gave no sign for her to stop, so she went on. "My father, Edmund Ashcombe, settled his estate for my benefit before his final illness. Since his death, my guardian, Mrs. Drusilla Vane, has told the world that I am disfigured, weak in mind, and unfit to manage my own concerns. She has prevented my letters from reaching those who might have answered for me. These are two of them." She lifted the charred fragments high enough to be seen. A murmur passed through the pews, then fell away again. Even from where he stood, the Duke could make out scorched edges, the torn remains of folded pleas never sent beyond the house where they were written. Drusilla rose abruptly. "This is intolerable," she said, color rushing into her face. "The girl is overtaken by nerves. She does not understand what she is doing." Lavinia turned her head then and met her aunt's eyes. "I understand it exactly." She reached to the cuff of her sleeve and with careful fingers drew out the folded note stitched there the night before. The paper was creased and warm from her skin. "This was written by my father in his own hand before his last illness. It speaks of the settlement made earlier for my secure benefit and directs that no alteration be made without my knowledge." Mr. Blaine took one involuntary step forward. The church had gone so still that the crackle of wick in tallow could be heard from the altar candles. Lavinia unfolded the note. Every rustle of the paper seemed loud in that hush. When she began to read, she did so in a clear, steady voice, and each word landed cleanly against the stone. When she finished, she lifted her eyes not to Drusilla, but to the man standing beside her. "Your Grace," she said, "I ask you to stand witness." And before anyone else could speak, the door of the vestry opened behind Mr. Blaine. The door opened upon Mr. Blaine and Martha Bell together, both damp from the weather and grave as judgment. Martha carried no basket now. In her hands was a flat parcel wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with string. Mr. Blaine came just behind her, his old face set in lines that looked carved by duty rather than age. The sight of them passing into the church from the vestry altered the room yet again. What had seemed, a moment before, the disturbance of one young woman now began to take the shape of evidence. Drusilla's color changed. It drained, then returned in a rush. "No," she said sharply, taking a step forward. "No servant dismissed from my household will be permitted to profane this sacrament with inventions." But it was too late for command. The words had already lost some of their power the moment another witness appeared carrying papers instead of gossip. Martha halted near the chancel rail, breathing quickly from haste and nerves. Her cloak dripped a little rainwater onto the stone. She looked first at Lavinia, then at the Duke, and at last at the vicar, as if seeking the one person in the room who could name order out of scandal. Mr. Blaine, steadier, bowed to the altar and then addressed the clergyman. "Sir," he said, "I crave pardon for the interruption, but I have in my possession documents touching the lawful estate of Miss Ashcombe, and I am prepared to attest that one note already read was written in her father's own hand. I have known it since he was a young man." The vicar's fingers tightened around the edges of his prayer book. His gaze passed helplessly again to Elias, who had not moved except to turn more fully toward the vestry door. There was a stillness in him now that no longer resembled coldness. It was the stillness of a man deciding whether duty means preserving ceremony or protecting truth. Lavinia did not wait for that answer to be spoken for her. She held out her hand. Martha came forward at once and placed the parcel in it. Through the paper, Lavinia felt the hard corner of the ledger and the thinner weight of the folded legal sheet. Her pulse struck once against her wrist where the stitches in her sleeve had already been broken. "This," she said, unwrapping the string with careful fingers, "is the codicil by which my aunt claims my father altered his settlement upon his deathbed. And this account book records payments connected to that alteration, including sums entered under false household expenses." A murmur moved through the pews like wind over dry leaves. Lady Honoria did not sit down. The broad-faced man behind Drusilla looked as if he wished himself elsewhere. Drusilla made for the chancel rail with sudden purpose, not quite rushing, but moving fast enough that her skirts whispered sharply over the floor. "Give me that paper," she said. "You do not know what you are handling." Lavinia drew it back against her breast. Before the aunt could advance another step, Elias spoke since the ceremony began. "Mrs. Vane," he said, and his voice was low, but it carried to the farthest pew. "You will remain where you are." She stopped as if struck by a visible force. Everyone heard it. The shift. A duke had entered the matter now, not as bridegroom or rescuer, but as a witness lending weight to the space in which truth could be spoken. Lavinia opened the folded sheet. The forged codicil crackled faintly in her hands. She saw again, in one glance, the clerk's stiff phrases, the cruel language applied to her person, the wavering signature meant to pass for her father's final will. Then she lifted her eyes to the congregation and began to read. The language of the paper condemned itself almost at once. Even before Lavinia reached the cruelest clauses, the tone of it stood apart from her father's note, as one voice stands apart from another in a dark room. Her father had written as a careful man, exact and plain. This document spoke of her as if she were an inconvenience to be managed, a weakness in the bloodline, a burden to be removed from direct possession of land and income. It dressed contempt in legal form. Under the vaulted roof of the church, every phrase sounded harsher than it must have done in a solicitor's chamber. She read on without hurrying. The candlelight trembled along the inked lines. Rain moved in little threads down the high glass. When she came to the clause naming Drusilla sole controller and beneficiary of the estate revenues until such future time as the girl might be proved competent, a stir passed openly through the witnesses. Lady Honoria's expression sharpened into something near disbelief. Even the vicar, who had begun the morning prepared to glide over inconvenience in the name of decorum, let out a faint breath through his nose. Drusilla seized upon that instant. "Enough!" she snapped. "Anyone can hear the poor child has been coached. Those words are beyond her understanding." Lavinia lowered the paper only long enough to answer. "Then it is fortunate, madam, that I have understood them better than you wished." The reply landed with a force out of all proportion to its quietness. A flush rose in Drusilla's cheeks. She turned at once toward Elias. "Your Grace, I entreat you, this is a domestic matter cruelly enlarged by servants and malice. If you allow it to continue, you invite a public disgrace." He did not answer her immediately. His gaze rested instead on the page in Lavinia's hands, then on the smaller note already read, and lastly on the scorched remnants of the letters tucked against the prayer book. When he did speak, his voice remained controlled, but something in it had hardened. "I have already been invited into it, madam," he said, "at the altar." No one mistook the meaning. Mr. Blaine came one step nearer, his old shoes scraping faintly against the stone. "With your permission, sir," he said to the Duke, "there is more in that account book than the paper alone. Entries marked to a copying clerk, money sent under false headings, and I will swear before God that Mr. Ashcombe's ordinary hand was firm, even in weakness. The signature upon that codicil has the look of guidance to it." The broad-faced man behind Drusilla tried to interject then, clearing his throat and muttering that legal interpretation ought not to be attempted in a church. But his protest fell flat. The ground had shifted too far beneath him. This was not rumor against respectability. It was paper against paper, witness against false guardianship. Lavinia opened the ledger to the marked page and read several of the entries aloud. She gave the dates. She gave the sums. She gave the line Martha had found in the back pages concerning the copied fair hand. Then, with care, she unfolded one of the blackened letter fragments and read what remained legible of her own plea for help. The words had broken in the fire, but their purpose was plain enough. She had asked to be seen, asked that someone come, asked whether her father had truly left her so dependent. By the time she finished, the silence in the church had become something almost sacred. It was the silence that comes when pretense has no room left to stand. Then Drusilla moved again, faster this time, reaching not for Lavinia, but for the ledger in Martha's hands. And at the same moment, Elias stepped between them. He did not touch his bride, he did not touch Drusilla either. He simply occupied the space between them with the quiet authority of a man who had long been obeyed and had no need to raise his voice in order to be so. The effect was immediate. Drusilla stopped short, one hand half extended toward the ledger, her breath coming fast enough to stir the lace at her collar. Elias's face had not altered much, yet there was something in it now that made further struggle look unwise. "No one will seize those papers," he said. The words were spare, but they settled over the church like a seal pressed into wax. For the first time that morning, Lavinia allowed herself one small breath of relief. She had not asked for rescue, but room in which truth might stand without being snatched back into silence. Mr. Blaine drew himself up a little straighter. Martha clutched the ledger against her apron with both hands. Even the vicar seemed grateful to have a line drawn for him, though he still looked like a man who would have preferred any other duty on earth. Drusilla recovered herself enough to attempt dignity. "Your Grace," she said, with an effort that made the title sound almost brittle, "you are being imposed upon by a hysterical girl and a discharged servant with a grievance. Must the sanctity of marriage be turned into a stage for domestic resentment?" Lavinia answered before he could. "Marriage has not been dishonored by truth, madam, only by deceit." A faint stir passed through the pews. Lady Honoria, still standing, did not hide the approval in her eyes. The broad-faced witness looked down at his gloves. Then the vicar, swallowing once, found at last the courage required of his office. "Mrs. Vane," he said, "you will refrain from interruption. Miss Ashcombe has advanced a grave charge supported by documents. This must be heard." The correction of title was slight, yet in that moment it mattered. Miss Ashcombe, not the poor girl, or the afflicted ward, or the managed dependent. The name of a person who could speak for herself. Lavinia turned the ledger toward the nearest light and indicated the entries Mr. Blaine had named. She did not embellish them. She did not plead. She let the plainness of the figures do their own work. Mr. Ames, fair copy. Mourning linen, witness fee. Then she read aloud the brief line written in the back, the one that had chilled her in the still room. "Girl continues to write. Must watch tray." The silence afterward was heavier than any outcry. Lady Honoria spoke then, not loudly, but with the kind of composure that belongs to women who have spent a lifetime being listened to. "That is not the language of guardianship," she said. "It is the language of possession." Drusilla turned toward her with visible alarm. Rank had entered against her now from a quarter she could not command, and she knew it. "My lady, you do not understand the burden under which I have labored. The child has always been fanciful. Her father's judgment—" "Her father's judgment," Mr. Blaine cut in, with more force than anyone had yet heard from him, "was sound enough to settle his daughter's future before sickness laid hold of him." That landed harder than anything else so far, because it came from an old man whose whole life had been spent in careful speech. Elias looked from Blaine to the codicil, then to Lavinia. When he spoke again, it was to the vicar. "If there is doubt as to fraud," he said, "say plainly what the law and conscience require. Must this ceremony proceed?" The question fell into the church like a stone into deep water. The vicar's fingers tightened around the prayer book. Drusilla went white. Martha stared. And every eye, even the Duke's at last, turned to Lavinia, waiting to learn whether she meant to leave the altar entirely or remain upon it and choose her next words with the whole room listening. For a moment she heard nothing at all. Not the rain, not the creak of pews, not even her own breathing. The whole church seemed to wait inside that question. Must the ceremony proceed? It was not being decided over her head. It had been placed plainly and solemnly before her. Lavinia stood with the opened papers in her hands, the veil fallen back over her shoulders, and felt the strange weight of choice after years in which every path had been chosen for her by other people. Drusilla found her voice first. "She cannot answer that," she said quickly. "She is overwrought. Any girl would be. Your Grace, Reverend, you see how matters have been inflamed. Let her be taken home at once. This unfortunate exhibition need never travel beyond these walls." Lady Honoria turned her head and looked at her with a composure so complete it bordered on contempt. "It has already traveled beyond these walls," she said. "It was carried here in forged papers." The old vicar colored, perhaps from shame that his own office had nearly been used as a curtain over fraud. Mr. Blaine lowered his eyes and held his hat against his chest. Martha stood rigid by the rail, as if movement itself might somehow undo what courage had brought her to this place. And Elias? Elias watched Lavinia without pressing her, without prompting, without offering her the answer that would have been easiest for him. That, more than any declaration could have done, steadied her. She folded the codicil once, carefully, and placed it atop the ledger in Martha's hands. Then she turned to the vicar. "My purpose in speaking," she said, "was not to disgrace the church, nor to entrap His grace into a public scene. I was brought here under silence and falsehood. I would not enter marriage under either." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Every word fell cleanly into the hush. "I ask," she went on, "that these papers be received by proper witnesses at once, and that what has been spoken here be remembered exactly. My aunt has controlled my letters, my name, and my father's fortune. I will not surrender the truth merely because the altar is already dressed for a wedding." The broad-faced witness shifted again, but now he looked less like a man prepared to object than one calculating whether he wished his own name attached to such a mourning. The vicar glanced toward Elias, then back to Lavinia. "My child," he said, with more humility than she had yet heard from him, "if you do not wish to proceed, no Christian duty requires you to do so." It should have been simple then. She had spoken. The fraud was named. She could have stepped away. Yet life was rarely as clean as principle when a woman's safety, standing, and future rested on public opinion as much as on justice. If she left the church unmarried, Drusilla would not regain moral ground, but she would gain time to spread fresh stories, time to call Lavinia unstable, time to drag the matter through rooms where men preferred feminine silence to feminine fact. A duchess wronged was one thing. A discarded ward who had halted her own wedding was another. The truth should not have depended on such distinctions, but in the world she inhabited, it often did. Elias seemed to understand at least part of what moved across her face. He spoke then, quietly enough that only those nearest could hear it first, though the church caught and carried every syllable. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, using the name with deliberate respect, "if you wish to withdraw, you shall do so with my full public support. If you remain, it will not be under compulsion." Drusilla made a strangled sound. Lavinia turned toward the Duke fully then. She saw not warmth exactly, not yet, but seriousness, shame, and a kind of honor that had awakened too late to prevent the wrong, though perhaps not too late to stand beside the right. And then she asked him the question upon which everything now depended. "If I choose to stay," she said, "will you stand with me when the room turns against me?" The question seemed to pass through him with the force of something long delayed. Elias did not answer at once. The rain went on at the windows in its fine, even whisper. Somewhere in the nave a woman drew in breath and held it. The scent of wet wool, candle smoke, and old stone lay over everything. He looked at Lavinia fully now, not as a bride arranged for him by correspondence, not as the center of a disturbance he had unwillingly inherited, but as a woman who had stood in a church full of strangers and done what far stronger souls than hers might never have dared. When he spoke, his voice was low and perfectly clear. "Yes." Just that. No flourish, no gallantry offered for display. Yet because he said it without hesitation, and because every person in that church heard the steadiness of it, the word carried farther than a speech would have done. Lavinia felt something inside her unclench. The day had gone too far for safety, but ground. Enough ground beneath her feet to take one more step. Elias turned then to the vicar. "These documents must be secured," he said. "The lady's charge will be recorded. If there is legal doubt, let there be no moral confusion. She has spoken under my protection, and she will not be handed back into silence." Drusilla made a sound of outrage. Protection from her own kin? Your Grace, you are forgetting yourself. I think, said Lady Honoria from the front pew, it is you who have been too long remembered kindly. The rebuke landed like a slap, though no hand was raised. A few faces in the congregation shifted, not with scandal now, but with that grave discomfort which comes when respectable falsehood begins to collapse in public view. The vicar cleared his throat, regained some fragment of pastoral command, and directed Mr. Blaine and the broad-faced witness to accompany him into the vestry long enough to mark the papers and place their names to what had been seen and heard. The man obeyed with poor grace. He had no choice left that did not look like complicity. Lavinia stood very still while this was done. Martha remained close. Elias did not move away from her side, though neither did he presume to touch her. That restraint, more than any display of tenderness, told her what sort of man he might be when acting from conscience rather than convenience. She could also see the cost of the realization dawning in him. He had accepted her aunt's descriptions because they made marriage feel manageable. He had come expecting quiet duty. Instead, he had been made witness to a theft of voice, property, and personhood, all under the cover of female dependence and legal language. Shame sat with him now, but it had not turned him evasive. When the vicar returned, he looked pale and tired. "The documents have been seen and set aside," he said. "The fact of Miss Ashcombe's charge has been noted in the presence of witnesses. As to the marriage," he faltered there. Drusilla stepped forward again, though less boldly than before. "There can be no marriage after this disgrace," she said. "Surely no gentleman would persist." Lavinia turned her head toward the altar, toward the candles, toward the prayer book still lying open where the service had broken. Her whole life had been bent by other people deciding what could and could not be done with her. She felt the truth of that more sharply than ever. Then Elias addressed her by name. "Lavinia," he said, and it was the first time he had spoken it, "if you wish to leave this church unmarried, I will escort you out before anyone here and support your claim in every lawful way. If you wish to remain, then remain by your own choosing." The vicar lowered his gaze. Lady Honoria said nothing. Even Drusilla had gone silent, and in that silence Lavinia made her decision and lifted her chin to speak. When Lavinia finally spoke, the sound of her own voice seemed to return to her from the stone with a kind of solemn confirmation. "Then I will remain," she said. No one stirred at once. The answer was so calm, so free of trembling display, that for a breath the meaning of it had to settle over them all before it could be understood. She had not halted the marriage in order to flee it. She had halted it so that it might not proceed under falsehood. The distinction mattered. In that church, with rain at the windows and candles burning low in their sockets, it mattered more than any silk or title or arrangement of families. Drusilla found speech again in a rush. "This is madness," she said. "You cannot mean to bind yourself after such an outrage. Your Grace, I forbid—" "You forbid nothing here," Lady Honoria said. The aunt stopped, as if the words had struck the air from her. Lavinia turned to the vicar. "If the charge is entered and the papers secured," she said, "then I stand before you no longer under silence. I was given no honest choice in coming here. I make one now." The old man looked overwhelmed, but he was no longer looking at her as though she were a nuisance to be managed. He bowed his head a little, as one does before a difficult truth. Mr. Blaine crossed himself quietly. Martha pressed the ledger tighter to her breast, tears bright in her eyes, though she was trying with all her might not to shed them in public. It was Elias who shifted the moment from scandal toward sacrament. He stepped to stand beside Lavinia again, not crowding her, not claiming her, only taking the place proper to the vow he had just consented to share. His face remained grave, yet something in his whole bearing had altered. Before this morning, he had come to the altar prepared to complete an arrangement. Now he stood there as a man who had been corrected by conscience in full sight of witnesses. "Reverend," he said, "if Miss Ashcombe wishes the ceremony to continue, then let it continue with the record preserved exactly as it stands." The vicar looked from one to the other. "Very well," he said at last, though the words came with effort. "Let all present bear witness that the charge has been raised, the papers received, and the bride-elect proceeds by her own declared will." Bride-elect. Even that careful phrase carried a kind of dignity. The service resumed, but not as it had been before. Nothing could return to that earlier ease. The words now sounded newly weighted, each promise measured against the false promises that had nearly buried her. When the vicar asked whether she would take this man, Lavinia answered without haste. When he asked the same of Elias, the Duke's reply came low and certain. The rain softened. The candles gave off a warm smell of tallow and wick. Somewhere behind them, a bench creaked as someone shifted, as though the church itself were adjusting to a truer shape of the day. Then came the giving of the ring. Elias took the plain gold band from the vicar's hand. His fingers brushed Lavinia's bare glove at the knuckle with something more than formal contact. He did not look away when he placed the ring upon her finger. She saw then very clearly that shame was still in him, and respect beside it. Drusilla could bear no more. "This marriage is a mockery," she burst out. "She has trapped you all. The girl is her mother's daughter after all, clever, cold, and scheming to claim her name and fortune by spectacle." The words seemed to freeze the air. Lavinia went white, not because the insult was new, but because this one reached for her mother, whose memory had been one of the few things Drusilla had not yet dared profane openly in public. Elias turned, slowly, toward the front pew, and when he did, there was nothing weary in his face at all. The change in him was more arresting because it came without display. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not stride forward in theatrical anger. He simply looked at Drusilla Vane as if, in that instant, he had finished measuring her and found her wanting in every particular that mattered. The church felt colder for it. Even the witness lowered his eyes. "You will not speak of her mother again," he said. There was no room in the words for appeal. Drusilla, who had spent years ruling by tone and insinuation, met at last a will that did not bend around either. Her lips parted, but nothing came. Lady Honoria, still upright near the first pew, gave the slightest nod, as though some private question had at last been answered to her satisfaction. The vicar, taking refuge in form because form was all that remained to him, resumed the service from the place where it had been torn open and remade. His hands shook a little over the book. The ring was already on Lavinia's finger. The vows, interrupted and resumed, now sounded as though they belonged to another order of things entirely. When Elias spoke them, he did so without haste. When Lavinia answered, the tone of her own voice steadied her further. Whatever else this day had become, it was not false. At the close, the vicar pronounced them husband and wife. No one moved at first. There was no cheerful murmur, no easing of breath, no flutter of relieved conversation such a declaration ordinarily brings. The silence that followed felt nearer to awe than celebration. A wedding had taken place, yes, but so had a reckoning. Drusilla broke at last. "This is an abomination," she said hoarsely. "You cannot mean to leave with him as though this morning had altered anything. Your estate is still contested. Your place is still with your family." "My family," Lavinia said, turning to face her fully, "did not burn my letters." They were not loud. They did not need to be. Martha covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Mr. Blaine looked away, blinking hard. In that single sentence, Years of mistreatment were gathered into a plainness no one present could mistake. Elias extended his arm to his new wife then, formally, as if offering not romance but public standing. Lavinia placed her hand upon it. The contact was brief, gloved, and entirely proper, yet in the eyes of everyone watching, the meaning was unmistakable. She would not be returned to Vane House. Whatever legal struggle remained, she would face it from another threshold. Outside, the rain had eased to a silver mist. The church doors were opened and damp air moved in, carrying the scent of wet earth and yew. The little cluster of witnesses shifted toward the porch. Lady Honoria came first to Lavinia and bowed her head with grave courtesy. "You have done honor to your father," she said quietly. "Do not let anyone persuade you otherwise." Lavinia could not answer at once. She only inclined her head. Then came the practical business no one had yet dared name. The papers must be carried, copies must be made, statements must be signed. The vicar, now fully awake to his duty, proposed that the documents remain sealed under his care until a proper legal examination could be arranged. Mr. Blaine offered himself as witness. The man, pale and resentful, muttered agreement because refusal would have ruined him. And while all this was being settled in low, urgent voices beneath the church porch, a groom from Stratton House came splashing through the gravel with a leather case under one arm and a message in his hand. He bowed to Elias, glanced once at Lavinia with startled respect, and said, "Your Grace, Mr. Pritchard has sent word from town. A physician has come forward regarding Mr. Ashcombe's final illness, and he says he has information that cannot wait." The message altered the business of departure at once. What had already been a wedding unlike any other now became the beginning of a campaign. Elias broke the seal under the church porch while the mist drifted across the gravel and dampened the hem of Lavinia's gown. His eyes moved quickly over the page. Then he folded it again with great care, as though careless handling might somehow disturb the importance of what had been written there. "He is on his way to Stratton House," Elias said. "Pritchard has kept him there until we arrive." Drusilla, hearing this, gathered herself for one last effort. "A physician can prove nothing after the fact. You are chasing phantoms, all of you. This farce has gone far enough. Lavinia, come with me now, and I may yet persuade the world that this morning was no more than a fit of nerves." Lavinia looked at her for a long moment. The rain had silvered the front of her aunt's cloak and flattened the dark feathers on her bonnet. She looked older suddenly and smaller, though no less dangerous. "You cannot persuade the world of that," Lavinia said. "Too many people have heard me." It was the truest thing she had ever spoken to her. The carriage steps were lowered. Lady Honoria saw Martha safely into a smaller vehicle with Mr. Blaine and the sealed papers, all to proceed under the vicar's authority until the proper examination could be made. The witness departed without meeting anyone's eye. Drusilla remained standing beneath the porch, rigid with fury, while Elias handed Lavinia into the Stratton carriage. He did it with formal care, touching only her gloved hand and elbow, yet after all that had happened, the smallest civility felt immense. Inside, the coach smelled of leather, wool rugs, and rain carried in on hems. For the first few moments, neither of them spoke. Wheels rolled over wet gravel, the church faded behind them. Lavinia sat opposite her husband, her veil folded now in her lap like a surrendered banner. Her ring felt strange on her finger, warm from her own skin and heavy with new meaning. She had gained freedom in the same hour she had bound herself to a stranger. The thought might have frightened her more if she had not already stood through the worst thing she had ever done. At length Elias said, "I owe you a plain apology." She lifted her eyes. "I accepted another person's account of your life because it suited my weariness," he went on. "I believed what was convenient. That failure is mine." He looked out briefly through the rain-streaked glass, then back at her. "You asked for a witness, not a rescuer. I understand the distinction, and I am grateful you made it." They were simple, and because they were simple, she believed them. "You gave me room to speak," she said quietly. "That is not a small thing." "No," he answered, "it is not." The horses lengthened their stride as the road opened. The countryside beyond the windows ran green and blurred beneath the weather. Since dawn, Lavinia let her shoulders rest against the squabs. Exhaustion came over her in a slow, deep wave. Yet under it there was something steadier than relief. She had not been returned to Vane House. She had not been dismissed as disordered or petty. The Duke had heard her, the Church had heard her, and now a physician waited ahead with more truth. An hour later, when the towers of Stratton House began to emerge through the rain, Elias reached into the inner pocket of his coat and drew out the letter from Pritchard once more. "There is one line I did not read aloud beneath the porch," he said. Lavinia looked at him, suddenly cold again. He unfolded the sheet. "The physician says he was present on the last evening of your father's lucidity, and that another document was placed before him after midnight." By the time they reached Stratton House, the rain had thinned to a pale mist that clung to the lawns and turned the gravel drives silver. The house itself rose out of it in long gray lines of stone and tall windows blurred with weather, solemn without being forbidding. Footmen came down the steps in haste. The great front doors stood open. Warmth, beeswax, and the faint scent of cedar met them as they entered, and Lavinia, who had expected to feel only strangeness, felt instead the sharp unsteadiness of crossing a threshold she had never imagined would truly open for her. There was no formal welcome, no line of servants arranged to admire a bride. News had outrun ceremony. Pritchard was waiting in the entrance hall with a leather portfolio under one arm and a physician beside him, a narrow man in a dark traveling coat with reins still shining on the shoulders. His hair was streaked with gray. His face had the strained look of someone who had carried an old silence too long. "Your Grace," Pritchard said, bowing. Then, with greater gravity, "Your Grace." He inclined his head to Lavinia with the respect due her new rank, but there was more in it than courtesy. There was recognition. The physician came forward. "Madam," he said, and his voice caught slightly on the word, "I am Dr. Stephen Harrow. I attended your father in his last illness." Lavinia did not know whether to step nearer or farther away. The hall lamps had just been lit. Their glass chimneys glowed amber against the wet light from outside. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock ticked with maddening calm. Elias removed his gloves and said, "We will hear Dr. Harrow in the small library. No one is to disturb us." The room they entered was warm, close, and lined with dark shelves. A fire had been built up in haste, and the crackle of it gave the scene an almost domestic air that sat strangely beside the business at hand. Lavinia remained standing. She could not yet trust herself to sit. Her wedding gown felt heavy with damp at the hem. Elias stood near the mantel, one hand resting against it, while Pritchard laid out ink, paper, and sand, as though preparing a deposition. Dr. Harrow did not begin at once. He looked at Lavinia with the pained steadiness of a man judging whether truth, after long delay, is still mercy. "At the time," he said slowly, "I believed your father's affairs were being handled in the ordinary way. He was very weak by evening, but before that, he was entirely clear in mind. He spoke of you more than once. He said the settlement already made for his daughter must remain untouched. Those were his words." Lavinia closed her hand around the back of a chair until the carved wood pressed into her palm. Harrow continued, "Near midnight I was called again, not for his health, but because Mrs. Vane and Mr. Felbrick wished me to witness a paper. Your father was barely conscious then. A document had been prepared and placed before him. I objected that he was in no condition. I was told it was merely a memorandum confirming matters already agreed." Elias's expression changed very little, yet the room seemed to tighten around him. "Did he sign it?" Lavinia asked. Dr. Harrow drew a breath. "Madam." His hand was guided. The words seemed to leave an actual mark upon the room. Guided. So much of what had remained inferential, suspicious, or morally obvious was suddenly plain in a way no careful listener could mistake. The physician had seen. The fire in the grate gave a little crack. Rain tapped once at the window and ran down the glass. No one spoke for several breaths. Lavinia was the first to move. She let go of the chair back and sat down at last, not because she felt faint, but because grief had entered the room beside justice and asked to be acknowledged. Her father's last hours, which she had carried in memory as a blur of fever, exhaustion, and exclusion, had taken on a new, bitter outline. Men had stood at his bedside. A paper had been laid before him. Her aunt had been there. A lawyer had been there. And while he faded, the future meant for his daughter had been bent by other hands. Dr. Harrow, seeing something of that understanding pass over her face, bowed his head. "Madam, I should have spoken sooner. I feared scandal. I accepted Mr. Felbrick's assurance that it was a formality. When I left the house, I told myself I had seen nothing I could prove. That was cowardice dressed as discretion." There was no self-pity in the confession, which made it heavier rather than lighter. Elias did not excuse him. "Will you put this in writing?" "I will," Harrow said at once. "And swear to it." Pritchard had already drawn paper toward him. He wrote in a neat, rapid hand while Harrow dictated the essential facts: the hour, the state of Mr. Ashcombe's strength, the physician's objection, the misleading explanation, the guided signature. Each sentence laid another timber into the structure of proof now rising around Lavinia's claim. She listened closely, not because she doubted Harrow's sincerity, but because after such years she no longer believed justice could rest on goodwill alone. It required record, it required witnesses, it required exact words set down before memory grew convenient. When the first page was completed, Elias sanded it, shook the excess away, and passed it across for Harrow's signature. His movements were composed, but there was a visible restraint in them now, a tightness through the shoulders, a stillness at the jaw. Anger, she thought. Not the vain kind that resents disorder, but the grave kind that rises when one recognizes harm after participating, however unwittingly, in the conditions that allowed it. He looked at her then. "There may be more," he said. "If Felbrick was present, there will be clerks, copied drafts, fee books, perhaps correspondence. Once one lie is forced into daylight, it often throws a shadow behind it." Lavinia nodded. Her wedding gown still rustled when she moved, a strange reminder that all this was unfolding on the same day she had become Duchess of Stratton. The title felt unreal. The evidence did not. Harrow signed, Pritchard blotted. Elias added his own note as receiving witness. The clock on the mantel chimed the quarter hour. Life, indifferent and exact, continued to measure itself while reputations fell and rose beneath it. At length, Harrow drew from the inner pocket of his coat a small folded paper, yellowed at the creases. "There is one more thing," he said. "I had forgotten it until Mr. Pritchard's message forced me to search my old casebooks. It is not formal evidence, perhaps, but it may matter." He passed it to Lavinia. She opened it and recognized at once her father's hand. It was not a legal instruction. It was a private note, written hurriedly across a page torn from his memorandum book, and in the middle of it, beneath an unfinished line about settling matters for his daughter, was one name written twice, as if he had been trying to warn someone before the ink failed him. Drusilla Felbrick. For a little while, no one in the library spoke above a murmur. The house itself seemed to understand that something grave had settled under its roof. Firelight moved along the spines of the books. Wet branches tapped faintly at the window panes. On the table between them lay the physician's signed statement, her father's hastily written note, and the remains of a morning that had begun as a wedding and turned into an accounting before God and witnesses alike. Lavinia read the unfinished note again. The ink had thinned toward the end, as if her father's strength had thinned with it. There was no accusation completed, no formal sentence to carry into court, only those two names, written twice, with a broken line beneath them. Yet to her it felt more intimate than any legal proof. He had known something was wrong. He had tried, with failing hand and failing time, to leave her a warning. The sorrow of that entered her differently from outrage. Outrage could keep one standing. This was the kind of grief that bent the head. Elias saw the change in her face and did not speak into it at once. He drew a chair nearer the fire instead, not insisting, merely making a place. When she did not protest, he set the note down carefully and said, "You need not continue this tonight unless you wish it." "Yes," she said after a moment. "I do." The answer was quiet but certain. If she stopped now, she knew too well what would happen. Delay had always favored those with doors to close, letters to intercept, and servants to direct. Pritchard understood that without needing it explained. He opened his portfolio and drew out a second packet tied in green tape. "These came by special messenger not an hour before you arrived," he said. "I had not opened them without your Grace's leave. They concern Mr. Felbrick's business accounts." Harrow looked up sharply. Elias glanced from the packet to Lavinia. "Will you see them now?" She nodded. Pritchard cut the tape with a paper knife. Inside were copied extracts from a clerk in town who had once worked under Felbrick and left his service after a dispute over unpaid wages. The copies were dry, neat, and damning in their own restrained fashion. Receipts entered under false descriptions. A private payment from Drusilla to Felbrick several days before Mr. Ashcomb's death. Another to the clerk Ames after it. And one memorandum, unsigned but clearly filed among the rest, noting that the physician proved inconveniently scrupulous and must not be troubled again. Dr. Harrow shut his eyes for a brief instant. The room felt smaller after that. Elias rested both hands on the back of a chair and stared down at the page as if he might force it to say less than it did. Lavinia, oddly, felt calmer. Each new piece of proof hurt, but it also clarified. The shape of the theft was not smoke and instinct and social malice. It was method. It was record. It was people making choices in lamplight, trusting a young woman would never be allowed to answer them in public. Pritchard turned one more sheet from the packet. "There is an address here," he said. "Ames has left his old lodging, but the forwarding direction was entered in the margin by the clerk who copied these extracts." Elias lifted his head. "Where?" Pritchard looked down at the page. "At Drusilla Vane's dower house in the North Lane, and the note says he was seen there yesterday." Since entering Stratton House, Elias moved as the master of it in more than title. He rang. The bell's sharp note cut through the library's hush, and within moments a footman appeared at the door, pale from the weather and startled to find the Duke, his new Duchess, the secretary, and a physician gathered over papers as if the whole fate of a county depended upon ink. In a sense, for Lavinia, it did. "Send Captain Reeves to me," Elias said, "immediately, and tell the stable that 2 fast horses are to be saddled without delay." When the servant bowed and disappeared, Pritchard laid a hand over the copied extract as though anchoring it. "If Ames is there, he may run the instant he hears the matter is exposed." "He will run," Elias said, "or he will burn what remains. Either way, he must be met before rumor outrides us." Lavinia had risen from her chair again. Fatigue sat heavily in her limbs, but the thought of waiting here while men went out to gather the last living thread of the fraud felt intolerable. "I will come," she said. 3 men turned toward her. Dr. Harrow looked merely alarmed. Pritchard looked practical. It was Elias who answered. No. The word was not harsh, yet it was firm enough to halt her reply for a breath. He stepped nearer, though he kept the space between them proper. You have stood through enough for one day, he said. This is now a matter of pursuit and seizure. It is not work I will ask of you. It is my cause, she said. It is, he agreed. And because it is, I mean to shield it from avoidable hazard where I can. The answer might once have angered her, had she heard in it the old language of dismissal. But she did not. There was no assumption of weakness in him now, only care and a dawning habit of placing her at the center of decisions even when he opposed her. It struck her, unexpectedly, with warmth. Captain Reeves arrived before she could speak again. He was a broad-shouldered man with weather in his face and an old scar running from temple to jaw. He listened without interruption while Elias outlined the matter in swift, exact terms. The copied accounts, the forwarding address, the need to secure any papers in Ames's possession before destruction or flight. Reeves asked 2 questions only. Was Ames violent by reputation? No. Could local constables be summoned if resistance were met? Yes, and immediately. Then he bowed to Lavinia with the grave respect due a duchess, and perhaps also a woman whose courage had already become known within the house. While he went to make ready, Harrow set down his pen and asked quietly whether his statement should be copied twice. Pritchard answered yes. One for the solicitor appointed by Stratton, one under seal against loss. The business moved around Lavinia now with a competence so unlike the managed stagnation of Vane House that she felt almost unsteady in it. Doors opened, orders were carried. Truth, once spoken, had begun to gather arms and legs. Elias drew on fresh gloves and took the memorandum from Pritchard. Before he turned away, he looked at Lavinia. I will not leave you uninformed, he said. Whatever is found, you shall hear it first from me. There was an intimacy in that promise, though nothing intimate passed between them. He was almost at the door when a maid appeared breathless in the hall and asked pardon of the housekeeper for interrupting. She carried a card on a salver, and her face suggested trouble. From Vane House, she said. A messenger has arrived with a letter for Her Grace, and he says Mrs. Vane requests an answer at once. The letter from Vane House spared them the need to wonder what fear had done to Drusilla. It was written in a hurried, blotted hand, unlike her usual neat control, and though she tried to dress it in injured dignity, panic showed through every line. She denied nothing plainly. That was the most telling part. Instead, she pleaded ill health, accused servants of theft, hinted that Ames had acted beyond instructions, and begged for a private meeting before irreparable scandal ruined them all. Folded within it was a second paper, unsigned but in Felbrick's hand, demanding the immediate return of all estate papers unlawfully taken from his client. Elias had scarcely finished reading when Captain Reeves returned, boots wet from the yard, and reported that the clerk had been found trying to leave by the back lane of the Dower House with a locked cash box under his arm. What followed moved quickly, almost mercifully so. The box was opened in the presence of Reeves, Pritchard, and Dr. Harrow. Inside were copied drafts of the codicil, receipts in Ames' hand, and a note from Felbrick instructing that the physician's objections be omitted from any clean record. There was even a practice sheet bearing Mr. Ashcombe's signature, written over and over in different inks until the resemblance had grown almost convincing. By nightfall, with statements taken and seals applied, the legal spine of the fraud lay bare. Felbrick sent word he had taken suddenly to his bed. Drusilla did not request another meeting. She left the Dower House before dawn 2 days later under her maid's care, and went to a distant relation who had neither rank enough nor affection enough to protect her from what was coming. The formal judgment, when it came, was less dramatic than the church and more final. The settlement was affirmed. The estate revenues were restored to Lavinia, and accounts were ordered. No speech could have equaled the simple effect of hearing her father's intention named as lawful after so many months of distortion. She sat beside Elias when the last paper was read. He did not reach for her before the room, but once they were alone, he took her hand with a care that was more moving than any display. "You have been fighting for your own life in silence," he said. "I should have seen sooner what sort of courage that requires." She looked down at the gold ring that had been placed on her finger in the midst of scandal and truth, and answered with the steadiness hard won from all that had gone before. "You saw when it mattered." In the weeks that followed, the house changed with a quietness that felt almost holy. Letters left by the front hall and were actually sent. Doors remained open. Sun was allowed into rooms that had long been kept shuttered by grief or habit. Lavinia had her father's unfinished note placed in a small glass frame upon the writing table in the morning room, not as a relic of sorrow, but as a witness that even a failing hand may still point toward the truth. And when spring finally cleared the rain from the windows, the first thing she planted beneath them was rosemary. For remembrance, yes, but also because it keeps its scent best when touched. That evening, candles burned low in the library, while Elias read beside the fire and Lavinia wrote letters in her own name. Beyond the panes, the wet gravel of the drive had dried to pale silver, and no messenger waited upon it. If this story stayed with you, you're welcome to stay a little longer here as well. Subscribe and come back for the next one.